Foreign ministers from around the world convene in Paris to try and lay the groundwork for Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. But the two main players aren't even invited. Can France really revive a dead peace process? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, it's considered one of the world's longest-running conflicts, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian people. Every attempt to resolve the crisis has effectively failed. On Friday, foreign ministers from nearly 30 countries convened in Paris to try and figure out a way to restart those peace talks. But the two main players themselves, the Israelis and Palestinians, weren't invited. In the lead-up to the talks, the Palestinian Prime Minister called for a stricter timetable to implement any agreements. But the office of the Israeli Foreign Minister snubbed the talks altogether. The conference was part of a peace initiative France launched in January. Representatives from the European Union, Arab League and United Nations attended Friday's meeting. They all affirmed their commitment to a two-state solution and began working towards bringing the two sides back to the negotiating table by the end of the year. Well, Palestinians say they accept the framework, but Israel has rejected it. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists the best way to resolve the conflict is through direct talks and without preconditions. Well, France is already hinting at a backup plan, saying if the initiative fails, it will recognize a Palestinian state. Well, while foreign ministers and diplomats met in Paris, the reality in the occupied West Bank just goes to show how big the challenge is. Israel continues to use the demolition of houses as a tool of punishment. Hud Abdulhamid reports.
It was a Monday morning when they were awakened by the rumble of bulldozers. They barely had time to pack a few belongings.
My son had received a demolition notice, I didn't, but they destroyed everything. The pretext is that they don't want prefabricated structures here.
It's the second time the Mazar'a family has seen their homes demolished. The Israeli government says they don't have a proper permit and won't allow prefabricated units provided by the European Union to be set up here. Just there is the settlement of Ma'ali Adomin. Now, despite being illegal, it's been growing steadily over the years and is now home to more than 30,000 people. On the other hand, Palestinians who were born in this area rarely get the permit for building. It's the so-called Area C of the occupied West Bank. It means that it's Palestinian land that remains under full Israeli civilian and security control. That pretext allows the Israeli army to demolish houses. 591 Palestinian homes so far in 2016, according to the UN. In the meantime, settlements are gradually inching further across the occupied West Bank, and Israel is not changing the status quo.
The status quo is one that Israel, at a very slow pace, builds mostly in the settlement blocks. So even though the entire world talks about, rapid settlement expansion, that expansion is actually everything but rapid. However, it is also true that if it keeps on going and going and going and there's no end to it, the room for a potential Palestinian state gets smaller and smaller.
But Palestinians want a total halt to settlement construction.
I totally agree with our people when they say stop this joke of negotiating while settlements continue on the land that's supposed to be a Palestinian state.
As diplomats meet in Paris to revive the peace process, those living under occupation have little faith more talks will improve their lives.
What should we do? There won't be two states, they're not going anywhere, and we are staying on our land. There is no other choice.
The Bedouin here are rebuilding their homes, this time with wood and corrugated metal, knowing all too well they could be destroyed again at any time. Hud Abdulhamid for Inside Story.
Let's bring our guests into the show now. We have joining us from Jericho, Saeb Erekat. He's the Secretary General of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. From West Jerusalem, we have Mitchell Barak, an Israeli pollster for Kivun Global Research, a survey, research and political communications firm. He was also the spokesman for the former Israeli President Shimon Peres. And from Washington, D.C., we have Mark Gopin, the Director of the Center for World Religions, Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. If I could start with Mitchell in West Jerusalem. Why Israel so against the French initiative, which apparently tries to aim to restart this peace process?
Well, I think in the past Israel has had bilateral talks with the Palestinians, as Mr. Erekat can attest to, because he's been so involved in it. Israel has been involved in multilateral negotiations and talks, but never non-lateral negotiations, which included other countries speaking about Israelis and Palestinians. And I think that's an issue for Israelis. Israelis want to be part of the process. I think using an international community can be helpful, although Israelis, according to Israeli public opinion, are a little bit weary, both of Americans and Europeans at times. But I think that that can be used to leverage the talks, if there would be direct talks between Israelis and Palestinians. And that's what the Israeli leadership seems to want. And that's what I think the Israeli people also want.
Well, obviously, world powers have always been involved in the peace process, Mitchell. Isn't there a need for world powers to ensure that both parties live up to their commitments and this cycle doesn't get repeated again of each side claiming the other one is not living up to its commitments?
Absolutely, absolutely. And they've been involved in almost every agreement that the Israelis have had with the Palestinians, or even in negotiations, going back even to the Madrid talks in '91 that had different countries getting together in Madrid and speaking about peace. But to do it without the Israeli and Palestinians, the first thing, the situation on the ground here in Israel.
Well, that's supposed to be only a stage one, isn't it, Mitchell?
And Palestinians.
What we understand is towards the end of the year, there's supposed to be an actual attempt to put Israelis and Palestinians together. I don't think the French were thinking they were going to resolve this conflict just by talking to themselves.
The interesting thing is the Israeli and Palestinians don't live so far away. It's only a car ride away, either from Jerusalem to Ramallah or Jericho, or from Ramallah to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever else. You know, there doesn't have to be a big push to go international at this point. I think that, it would have been helpful, because both the Israelis and Palestinians, the interesting thing, they have had leaders, Abbas and Netanyahu, that have been in for the entire tenure of President Barack Obama. So they've been both elected by their peoples. They've both been there. And President Barack Obama, he won a peace prize, a Nobel Peace Prize. So maybe, leveraging him or getting him involved could have been a way to do that. And the other thing that I'll say about, I know that in the beginning of the program, you spoke about the settlements, occupation, and so forth. Prime Minister Netanyahu, a few years ago, actually froze settlements, which was something that was never done by an Israeli
Mitchell,
Prime Minister. And certainly he received a lot of flack.
Hold that thought about freezing settlements. We'll come back to that later. Let me continue, though, this point we're talking about with the Paris conference. Saeb, if you want to make peace talks, you do need to have talks with your adversary. Why not enter into direct talks with the Israelis?
As a matter of fact, that's what I have done in the last 23 years. I have done nothing but to negotiate with the Israelis on bilateral basis. I reached agreement with Israel as a Palestinian, and the Israeli various governments chose not to implement these agreements, and they're not implementing it now. They were supposed to stop settlement activities, including natural growth. They continue dictating settlements. As a matter of fact, from 2009 till now, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, increased settlements by 40%. And that's why, I'm surprised that Israelis who want me to continue the same business as usual, talk, bilateral, and then when we reach agreements, they don't implement. And when we reach agreements, they say no sacred dates. And when we talk about agreements, they continue with dictating settlement activities on the land that's supposed to be a Palestinian state. The significant thing about Paris today is the world is fed up with Israel. The world is fed up with Israel. We heard President Hollande saying, vacuum will lead to extremism.
Okay, but
extremism will be the name of the game in this region.
Forgive me for interrupting you too, but can the French initiative really work when it seems to be based on exactly the same process that you're explaining you've been involved in, a step-by-step approach to building peace? Isn't that what's actually failed over the last 2 decades?
No, what was the missing ingredient in the peace process was that if I violate any of my obligations emanating from agreements signed as a Palestinians, Israel has teeth. They can close Jericho, close Gaza, stop moving. If the Israelis, as usual, violate the agreements, don't implement, no sacred dates, what can I do? I write to the Americans and the French and the Germans and the Russians. This is why what we need outside of this.
How is this different now, though, Saeb, this time around? Does this initiative have any teeth, ability to hold both parties accountable?
Well, that's exactly the reason we're encouraging the French, is we want to hold both parties accountable. We want a mechanism, a framework. Let's call it 7+2, 2 Palestine and Israel. And if the Israelis say they honor agreements, of course the negotiations will have to be bilateral, but we want monitoring for these negotiations, because if it's my word against theirs, I'm dead. I don't stand a chance in the Congress, in the Senate, in your parliaments in Europe. And this is why I need to have the negotiations monitored. And above all, I need a framework. Once an agreement is reached, is that the international community will tell me that both of you, Israel and Palestine, will carry out your obligations emanating from the agreement to the second, to the minute, to the timeline provided for. This is why what we need from the Paris Initiative is not to negotiate for us, not to make decisions for us, but to ensure that the negotiations will be done within a time frame and the implementation will be done within a time frame, and that they have the mechanisms and the framework, let's say 7+2, to ensure the implementation of whatever is agreed.
Okay, that sounds a little bit along the lines of the negotiations that took place over Iran's nuclear program. Mark Gopin, the French president has been talking about guarantees of a solid peace, quote, under international supervision. What guarantees is France really in a position to give? It is not the preeminent world superpower, is it?
No, but it's exactly in a position to do what the Mitchell's comment about Israelis being uncomfortable. He's in a position to do exactly what they don't want to do, and that is for the train to leave the station without the population. So that pressure from France leading Europe at this point, with their frustration at inactivity and the danger of that for the European continent at this point, is the pressure that they are suggesting would have an impact on Netanyahu taking his own initiatives, which is exactly what's happened. He's desperately looking for an agreement led by Sisi. He's talking about the fact that he would come to Paris and do direct peace talks. All of this is an interesting effort to get something going at a time when the United States will never be leading at this point. And the Europeans are desperate to create a different dynamic with the Middle East at this point.
But hang on, Mark. Can France, it sounds almost like we're talking about France replacing the US as the mediator and the broker in the peace process. Is that really possible, do you think?
It's not. What it is it's a stimulant to change in the current status quo of where things have gone with no peace process, and continued a process of destruction of any possibility of an agreement due to what's happening on the ground. I think this is a political move that is meant by France leading the Europeans to stimulate something that would otherwise not be happening on the Israeli side. And it will create discomfort, and it will create a kind of movement. We'll see efforts by Netanyahu and others to create an alternative, and that in itself could lead to some interesting results. I think their effort is a political effort to open a window, to prevent the kind of compulsion that an international process would eventually lead to along legal grounds with the United Nations resolutions.
All right, talking about a political process not being welcomed by everyone, especially some of the Israeli officials like DORE Gold.
100 years ago, two officials by the name of Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot tried to dictate a new order in the Middle East. It was at the apex of the era of colonialism in our area. This effort utterly failed then and will completely fail today.
Those sorts of statements, of course, compare, interestingly, you could say, with what Chaim Weizmann wrote in his 1949 autobiography, Trial and Error, where he said, Sir Mike, referring to the very same Mark Sykes, which Dore Gold was talking about, entered into negotiations with us referring to the Zionist movement, and gave us his fullest support so that our claims in Palestine might be given room. Mitchell, is there a sense here when you do hear, it does sound like a bit of a double standard. Israel has relied obviously a lot on the intervention of international powers dating back to the 20th century to push forward its interests. Now it seems quite reluctant to have international involvement at some levels. Okay. I wonder whether you agree with Mark there that perhaps the involvement of the French, can that create the sort of international pressure? Can it really create the sort of international pressure that would force Netanyahu to do things which Ban Ki-moon is calling for, like freeze and stop settlements?
Well, it could be the right idea, even though for a lot of reasons of what we said it's not, but it's the wrong country. And here's an interesting thing. I've been doing survey research work for a German organization now for close to 10 years. And it turns out that we found all along the years among the Israeli public that Germany is trusted and relied upon by the Israeli public. Germany, Chancellor Merkel is seen as a very strong person. Germany is seen as a country, and Merkel is seen as a leader that is defending Israel in the United Nations and in the European Union and the United Nations. And Germany could actually take a lead role. And interestingly enough, we did focus groups this year among, as we did in previous years, among the Israeli Arab population. And before the Israeli Arab population was lukewarm on Germany, although they were supportive of Germany, they felt that Germany will always be on Israel's side. It changed this year because what the Israeli Arabs were telling us, because Germany actually took in close to 1 million refugees and immigrants from Syria and from other Arab countries, that they are seen as someone that is not just paying lip service to the peace process, and someone that could actually be an honest broker. So there would still need to be bilateral talks, but my insight would be is that Germany could take the lead role. Germany is trusted by Israelis, both the Jewish Israelis and Israeli Arabs, and Germany could actually do some good.
Okay, Saeb, if I could come back to you. If we're talking about a process, I think you called it the 7+2, with the European powers playing a lead role, where would the United States, do you really think the United States would sit comfortably with a sort of process, something similar to the model that was adopted in dealing with Iran's nuclear program, which had the sort of very strict deadlines, threats, sanctions, if that sort of scenario were to be applied to the Israelis?
Well, number one, I don't think the French are trying to replace the Americans. I don't think this is the idea. The idea is the French and the Germans and the British and the Europeans and the Arabs and the Africans and the Latins and the Asians, those who attended the conference today, are trying to complement the Americans, to help the Americans. And yes, in preparation for the conference before the end of this year, we suggested to the French that Germany should head a team, a working group, for Palestine institution building. The United States should head a working group for security, bilateral and regional. The Arabs, Jordan and Egypt should head a team to rebuild confidence and trust between Palestinians and Israelis by ensuring the implementation of agreement signs. The Swedes could lead a working group on human rights, women's rights, the rule of law. Norway can continue with the AHLC, the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee for Finances of the Palestinian Authority, and so on. I think this international effort today is not for Germany to replace the Americans or France to take over the role for the Americans. It's to complement each other, because the model of Palestinians and Israelis is not equal. I'm under their occupation. They have the teeth. They have suffocated me. They have, in every agreement I signed with them with timelines, they came out to say no sacred dates, and they were selective in implementing or not implementing. I don't want the international community to negotiate on my behalf or to make concessions and decisions on my behalf. It's me and the Israelis.
Right,
but I need
that's
the
point,
assurance
though, isn't it?
of the international community to complement the work in order to see to it that any agreement that's reached will be implemented. Because Israel cannot continue acting with impunity, settlement activities and dictations and so on.
Right, and if that happens again, who will be the power to step in and sort this out, though? That's really the crux of the question. Do you, Saeb, have confidence
the Americans,
in the Europeans
the Russians,
doing that?
Today,
I mean, Barack Obama tried to get the Israelis to stop settlement activity at the beginning of his presidency, and it failed.
yes, but if you ask the Israelis to stop settlements and they continue, you cannot treating them as a country above the laws of man. You cannot continue rewarding them. Because today, what is Washington doing in Damascus? Moscow is in Damascus.
Right.
London is in Damascus. Rome is in Damascus. Berlin is in Damascus.
Okay.
Paris is in Damascus. They're not picnicking there. There is a new map being withdrawn, and if you want to defeat ISIS, and we want to defeat ISIS, you can't kill ideas with bullets. You can't have ideas travel with visas. So what you need to do, two things: democracy in the Arab world and peace between Palestinians and Israelis.
All right,
you
I
need
can see
to
the
stop
other two guests.
treating Israel
I can
as
see
a
the other
country
two
above
guests.
the laws of man.
Let me give a chance to Mark Gopin, because we haven't heard from him in a while. We'll come back to you in a minute, Mitchell. Bear with us. Go ahead, Mark.
Ultimately, at all levels, two sides of a conflict always want to be in direct negotiations. That's what Netanyahu keeps on saying as a refrain. But Saeb is absolutely right that the problem has been till now is that there's no enforceability of commitments in that direct process. Whereas when the United States and others wanted to, for example, in Belfast, they had direct negotiations, but there was a very strict process of everyone on the outside of that direct negotiation being held to certain commitments.
Right, Mark. So do you see that same scenario arising now in this French initiative, that sort of direct enforceability?
Well, it would be very interesting if Prime Minister Netanyahu says, I can come to Paris right now and talk directly, call his bluff. In other words, you have the multilateral process to add pressure globally, but then you make an invitational moment for direct talks. However, they will be subject to enforceability by the global community on both sides. That to me would be a political opening that would be unprecedented, a little bit closer, a hybrid, not so much the Iran scenario, but something closer to the Ireland scenario.
All right, let me give Mitchell a chance to come in on this. What would be the game changer if we see a repeat scenario, Netanyahu going back to build settlements, or Israel going back to build settlements, which only today Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, called an affront? I beg your pardon. He said it's illegal under international law, and raises questions about Israel's commitment to the two-state solution. What would be the game-changing element to enforce the rules of this latest initiative?
Well, I think the initiative is not so relevant. I think a better initiative or something that could be more fruitful is something that's coming out of Egypt with Sisi. It's the involvement of Saudi Arabia. I think the major players in the region have also identified, not just as Saeb Erekat said, that ISIS, everyone wants to defeat ISIS, and he rightly said that there should be democracy everywhere in the Arab world, but the Iranian threat threatens the stability of the region. But I think Mark is absolutely right. The Palestinians should call the bluff of not just, and now it's not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's Defense Minister Lieberman. Both of them have come out within the past week or 2 weeks and reiterated their commitment to a two-state solution. Okay, the Prime Minister during Israeli Independence Day reached out to the diplomatic community and said, please help me get a meeting with Abu Mazen. Now, whether or not he was sincere in that, whether or not he's really tried to do that, the point is now is really a window of opportunity because we have a very right-of-center government. There are rumblings and grumblings in Israel right now that the Zionist Union, led by Herzog, should also join the government, and it could be a real national unity government, which could actually move things forward. So, whereas, we might want to get bogged down with he said this and who said this and the international conference. The Palestinians have a great opportunity. And again, looking at public opinion research,
let me jump in there, because I think
they want peace or they just want quiet.
All right,
so go directly to the Israeli people.
We've got about 30 seconds left now, so I could see Saeb was shaking his head and laughing at the same time. So go ahead, Saeb. Respond to the call, perhaps. Why don't the Palestinians take the opportunity and call the bluff? 30 seconds, Saeb.
Okay, now what if the people who met in Paris today will hold an international conference, invite Palestinians and Israelis, Abu Mazen and Netanyahu, and tell them within this time frame, you get to the negotiations, we're monitoring you, and we will have this framework for enforceability once an agreement is reached. Do it. Now we have an opportunity, and we're not against negotiations, but we want this international umbrella with timelines, a new time frame, and enforceability.
Let's thank our guests, Saeb Erekat, Mitchell Barak, and Mark Gopin. And thank you for watching this episode. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there, @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.